Settle into a comfortable position. Let your breathing slow. Tonight, we journey back to one of history's harshest realities, the Soviet Gulag system under Stalin. You'll experience the frozen labor camps of Siberia, witness the political machinery of the Great Terror, and explore the stark contrasts of Soviet society. But here, in your warm bed, you are safe. The past cannot reach you. Let these distant hardships remind you of the comfort you possess now, as we drift through history together. The Soviet Union, from the 1930s through the 1950s, operated a vast network of forced labor camps stretching across the most remote and inhospitable regions of the country. Millions passed through these camps, building infrastructure, mining resources, and felling timber in conditions that tested the very limits of human endurance. Tonight, we'll walk through their days, understand the mechanisms that sent them there, and contrast their suffering with the privileged few who orchestrated this system. Close your eyes. Imagine the bitter cold, and remember how far removed you are from it. Imagine yourself lying on bare wooden planks in a barrack thick with the breath of 200 men. The air is cold enough to see each exhalation, despite the press of bodies. Outside, the Siberian winter maintains its grip at 40 degrees below zero. Inside, the meager heating barely raises the temperature above freezing. You were arrested 6 months ago on fabricated charges. Perhaps you told a joke about the government, or a neighbor denounced you to fulfill an arrest quota, or someone needed your apartment. There was no trial. A troika of 3 officials reviewed your case for perhaps 10 minutes and sentenced you to 10 years of corrective labor. The wake-up comes at 5 in the morning. Not a gentle rousing, but the clang of metal on metal and shouting guards. Your body aches from yesterday's labor, and from the hard boards you've slept on. There are no mattresses, no blankets sufficient for this cold. You've learned to sleep in your clothes, all of them, and still you wake shivering. Around you, men rise slowly, their movements careful. Some don't rise at all. During the night, 3 men died quietly in their sleep, their bodies discovered only now in the dim light of dawn. The guards will record their deaths with bureaucratic efficiency. More bunks available, more rations to redistribute. You shuffle to the latrine with hundreds of others. The facilities are crude planks over pits. No privacy, no running water. The smell is overwhelming, but after months here, you barely notice. Washing is perfunctory. There is a pump outside, but the water freezes almost instantly on your skin. Most prisoners gave up on hygiene long ago. Lice are universal. Disease spreads easily through the barracks: typhus, dysentery, tuberculosis. You've learned not to look too closely at the sores on other men's faces, not to wonder if you'll develop them too. Breakfast arrives in metal bowls. Today, like every day, it is balanda, thin soup made from spoiled cabbage or fish heads, perhaps with some millet floating in the gray liquid. There is bread 400 grams if you failed to meet yesterday's work quota, 700 if you succeeded. The bread is dense and often mixed with sawdust to stretch the flour. You eat it anyway, carefully, making it last, because this may be the only meal that contains any substance at all. The camp operates on a simple principle. Fulfill your work norm and receive the full ration. Fall short and starve slowly. It is a cycle designed to extract maximum labor before death. At 6 in the morning, you line up for count. The guards count and recount, their fingers stiff in their gloves. They are cold too, though they have warmer coats, felt boots, and the knowledge that they will return to heated quarters. You have wadded cotton clothing that barely keeps the wind out, and boots held together with wire. Many prisoners wrap their feet in rags. Frostbite is inevitable. You've already lost feeling in 2 toes. They've turned black. You don't mention it because a trip to the infirmary often means you remarked as unable to work. And unable to work means reduced rations, which means death. The march to the work site takes an hour through snow that reaches your knees. The forest stretches endlessly in every direction. dense with the pine and larch that you and 10,000 others are here to harvest. The Soviet Union is building, always building railroads and canals and cities, and it needs timber, needs coal, needs gold. The labor is free. You are not slaves, the system insists. You are being reformed through labor. This is correction, not punishment. The irony would be laughable if you had energy left for laughter. The logging quota is 5 cubic meters per day. For a healthy man with proper tools and adequate food, this would be challenging. For you underfed, exhausted, working with a dull saw and a blunt axe, it is nearly impossible. But you try. You must try, because failure to meet the norm means even less food tomorrow, which means you'll be even weaker, which means you'll fall further behind. It is a death spiral, and you've watched dozens of men disappear into it. You work in a brigade of 30 men. Some are political prisoners like yourself, intellectuals, engineers, teachers, party members who fell from favor. Others are common criminals, the Blatny or Urki, who have developed their own vicious hierarchy within the camp. These criminals receive a kind of informal permission from the guards to rule over the political prisoners. They take the best bunks, steal rations, and enforce their own brutal justice. The camp administration sees them as useful. They maintain order among the politicals, who are viewed as more dangerous to the state. A thief who steals can be reformed through labor. A person who thought the wrong thoughts is irredeemable. The temperature remains far below freezing throughout the day. Your fingers, even wrapped in rags, lose their dexterity within the first hour. The saw slips. The axe swings wide. Each mistake costs time, and time is the quota slipping away. By midday, when you receive another bowl of thin soup, you've managed perhaps 2 cubic meters. You're falling behind. Everyone is falling behind. The brigade leader, himself a prisoner, but one who has learned to collaborate with the guards to stay alive, shouts and threatens. Complete the norm, or everyone's ration is cut. The group's failure is each individual's failure. The Urki watch your struggle with amusement. They have their own code, the Blatny ethics, which values toughness and cunning. They mock the political prisoners as enemies of the people, even while they themselves are imprisoned. Some of them don't work at all. They've made deals with guards, or they intimidate others into fulfilling their quotas for them. At night, they gamble with bread rations and stolen belongings. Sometimes they gamble with other prisoners' lives. You've learned to avoid them, to make yourself small and unnoticeable. But in the crowded barracks, invisibility is impossible. One of the intellectuals in your brigade, a former university professor, arrested for anti-Soviet agitation, which meant he taught history accurately rather than according to party doctrine, collapsed today. He simply stopped sawing, stood still for a moment, and then fell forward into the snow. The brigade leader checked for a pulse, found none, and signaled the guards. They dragged the body aside. Work continued. There would be a report filed, a number recorded in a ledger somewhere in Moscow. The professor becomes a statistic, one of 1,053,829 who died in the Gulag system between 1934 and 1953, according to archival records studied after the Soviet Union's fall. But these numbers are disputed. Some scholars believe the true toll is far higher, while others argue the official records, now accessible, provide the most accurate count. By the time work ends at 6 in the evening, darkness has long since fallen. The march back to camp is slower than the morning journey. Men stumble. Some fall and are dragged forward by their brigade mates, because leaving a prisoner behind invites questions and punishment for the entire group. You are so tired that the cold feels almost distant, as if it's happening to someone else's body. Your hands are raw despite the rags. Blood has frozen in dark streaks on your palms. Back at the barracks, there is evening count, another thin soup, and then the announcement of work norms met and unmet. Your brigade fell short. You completed only 85% of the quota. Tomorrow's ration is reduced. The brigade leader curses. The Yerky laugh. One of them asks if anyone wants to trade their bread for a cigarette. A man near you, hollow-eyed and skeletal, agrees. He'll die within the week, you think. Most prisoners who reach that stage of starvation don't recover. The camp has a term for them. Dokodiaga, the walking dead. There is no leisure. Some then try to mend their clothes, stitching torn fabric with threads pulled from old rags. Others simply lie on their bunks and stare at the ceiling. Conversation happens in low murmurs. You must be careful what you say. Informants are everywhere prisoners who trade denunciations for extra rations or easier work assignments. A careless word about conditions, a criticism of Stalin, and your sentence can be extended by another 5 or 10 years. There are men here serving 25-year sentences who arrived on 5-year terms but spoke unwisely. Sleep comes not from comfort, but from exhaustion. You lie down on your boards, use your arm as a pillow, and try not to think about tomorrow, which will be identical to today, and the day after, and the day after. You have 9 years and 6 months remaining on your sentence, assuming you survive that long. The arithmetic is simple. Most prisoners don't make it. The work is too hard, the rations too small, the cold too severe. The Gulag system was designed to extract economic value from undesirable populations while simultaneously eliminating them through attrition. The system called it correction. It called the camps a place where parasites and enemies could be reformed into productive Soviet citizens. But reform required survival, and survival required luck and ruthlessness, and a physical constitution strong enough to endure months and years of systematic deprivation. You close your eyes. The man next to you coughs a deep, wet sound that speaks of tuberculosis. Somewhere in the darkness, someone weeps quietly. Another day ended. Another day survived. In Siberia, that counts as victory. The labor camps we've just walked through did not fill themselves. Behind every prisoner shivering in Siberia stood a vast machinery of accusation, interrogation, and condemnation. Between 1936 and 1938, this machinery accelerated into what history would call the Great Terror, a period when the Soviet state turned upon itself with a ferocity that consumed not only ordinary citizens, but the very architects of the revolution. The show trials in Moscow were the public face of this purge, theatrical performances designed to demonstrate that even the most loyal old Bolsheviks had become enemies requiring elimination. Imagine yourself in Moscow in the summer of 1936. The city is recovering from the famine and upheavals of collectivization. There is a sense, carefully cultivated by propaganda, that the worst is past. The new Soviet constitution is being drafted. Stalin speaks of life becoming better, more joyous. And then, in August, comes the announcement. 16 prominent party members, including Gregory Zinoviev and Lev Kamenev, men who had stood beside Lenin during the revolution, are to be tried for terrorism, conspiracy, and plotting to murder Stalin. The trial takes place in the October Hall of the House of Unions, a grand space with columns and chandeliers where once the Moscow nobility held balls. Now it is packed with party officials, foreign journalists, and carefully selected workers there to witness justice. The 16 accused sit in a special dock. They look tired, some appear confused. But when questioned, each confesses in elaborate detail to crimes that strain credulity. They admit to forming a Trotsky-Zinoviev terrorist center. They confess to plotting assassinations. They claim to have been working for fascist powers, attempting to sabotage Soviet industry, planning to restore capitalism. Zinoviev and Kamenev had been Lenin's closest comrades. Zinoviev had chaired the Communist International. Kamenev had edited Lenin's writings. They were theoreticians of revolution, not terrorists. Yet here they stand, confessing. The prosecutor, Andrei Vyshinsky, a former Menshevik who remade himself into Stalin's judicial enforcer, demands their deaths. "Shoot these mad dogs," he cries. The defendants do not protest. They accept their guilt. They beg only that their families be spared, that the party they served continues toward the bright future. The truth, which would emerge only decades later when archives opened, was simpler and darker. Zinoviev and Kamenev had been interrogated for months before the trial. Yezhov, the head of the NKVD secret police, appealed to their devotion to the party. He told them Trotsky was fomenting anti-Soviet sentiment abroad. He promised that Stalin, on behalf of the entire Politburo, guaranteed their lives and their families' safety if they confessed publicly. Exhausted, isolated, believing perhaps that their sacrifice would serve some larger good, they agreed. On August 24, 1936, all 16 were sentenced to death. The next day, they were shot. The promise of mercy had been a lie. The first trial was merely the beginning, the visible tip of a process that would soon engulf hundreds of thousands. The confessions at trial implicated others co-conspirators who had not yet been arrested. Vast networks of saboteurs supposedly honeycombing Soviet institutions. Each interrogation produced new names. Each new name led to new arrests. The terror metastasized. In January 1937, a second show trial convicted 17 more party members, including Yuri Pyatakov, a deputy commissar for heavy industry. Again, the charges centered on Trotskyist conspiracy, sabotage, and espionage. Again, the defendants confessed. Again, they were executed. The pattern was establishing itself. Confession, condemnation, death. The trials served multiple purposes. They demonstrated Stalin's vigilance against enemies. They provided scapegoats for economic failures and industrial accidents. And they sent an unmistakable message. No one was safe. No service to the revolution was sufficient protection. By mid-1937, the terror had reached the Red Army. Marshal Mikhail Tukhachevsky, the Soviet Union's most brilliant military strategist, was arrested along with 7 other top commanders in June. They were accused of conspiracy with Germany, of plotting a military coup. The evidence was fabricated, the confessions extracted through torture. When Tukhachevsky's written statement was later examined, it was found to be covered in blood spatter. The trial was conducted in secret, without lawyers or public audience. On June 11, 1937, all 8 were convicted. Before lunch, they were shot. The purge did not stop with the 8 marshals and generals. It cascaded through the entire military hierarchy. Officers who had served under Tukhachevsky were arrested. Anyone who had studied at the same military academies became suspect. Former connections, professional relationships, even casual friendships became evidence of conspiracy. By 1938, approximately 35,000 officers, about half the entire officer corps, had been arrested, imprisoned, or executed. 3 of 5 marshals were killed. 13 of 15 army commanders were shot. 8 of 9 admirals disappeared. 57 of 85 corps commanders were eliminated. The effect on military capability was catastrophic. The Red Army lost its most experienced leaders, its most innovative thinkers, its institutional memory of modern warfare. When Germany invaded in 1941, the Soviet military would be led by survivors and yes-men, officers promoted for loyalty rather than competence. The disaster of the war's first year, when millions of Soviet soldiers were killed or captured, had its roots in these purges. Stalin had effectively dismantled his own defense. The last and largest public trial occurred in March 1938. 21 defendants faced charges, including Nikolai Bukharin, once called the darling of the party, Lenin's favorite theorist, and Alexei Rykov, a former premier. Also among the accused was Genrik Yagoda, the former NKVD chief, who had himself organized earlier purges before being consumed by the process he served. The charges had expanded to include medical murder for Kremlin doctors were accused of deliberately killing party leaders through improper treatment. Bukharin was different from earlier defendants. He was more intellectually agile, more willing to challenge the absurdities of the accusations. He had held out for 3 months during interrogation, refusing to sign the prepared confession. But his interrogators were given the order beating permitted. His young wife and infant son were threatened. Physical pressure and psychological torture wore him down. When he finally read his confession, personally amended by Stalin, he withdrew it entirely. The process started again. Eventually, broken, he confessed to a pattern of sabotage and treason stretching back decades. Yet even in his confession, Bukharin resisted. He admitted to political opposition, but denied the specific accusations of murder and espionage. He spoke eloquently about his love for the Soviet Union, his mistakes, his guilt for having doubted Stalin's wisdom. It was a strange performance, a confession that was simultaneously an oblique defense, filled with coded messages that perhaps some future generation might understand. On March 15, 1938, he and 17 others were sentenced to death. Rykov wept. Bukharin remained calm. They were shot the same day. The show trials were merely the public spectacle. Behind them unfolded a vastly larger process of mass arrest and execution. In July 1937, Stalin issued NKVD Order No. 00447, which mandated the arrest of kulaks, criminals, and other anti-Soviet elements. Each regional NKVD office received quota-specific numbers of people to arrest and specific percentages to be executed versus sent to camps. Typically, these quotas were divided into 2 categories. Category 1 meant death. Category 2 meant 8 to 10 years in the Gulag. The quotas were arbitrary, divorced from any investigation of actual guilt. Regional officials competed to exceed their targets, demonstrating their vigilance and loyalty. Between August 1937 and November 1938, just 16 months, over 1.5 million people were arrested in these operations. Approximately 700,000 were executed. The condemned were shot in basements of NKVD headquarters, in forest clearings, in repurposed church buildings. They were buried in unmarked mass graves. Families were not informed. The state simply erased people. Parallel to the Kulak operation ran the so-called national operations targeting ethnic, minorities, and diaspora populations. There was a Polish operation, a German operation, a Latvian operation, operations against Greeks, Romanians, Finns, Estonians, Iranians, Chinese, and others deemed potentially disloyal due to their ethnicity or foreign connections. The Polish operation alone resulted in 140,000 arrests and 111,000 executions. 79% of those arrested were killed. The German operation produced 55,000 arrests, 76% executed. The logic was preventive. These people might become enemy agents in event of war, therefore eliminate them now. The national operations accounted for 335,000 arrests between July 1937 and November 1938. Nearly 250,000. Of those arrested, 74% were executed. The Harbin operation, targeting Russians who had lived in Manchuria, sentenced 33,000 people, of whom 65% were shot. For the Latvian operation, 75% received death sentences. These were not trials as any legal system would recognize. They were assembly line killings, bureaucratized murder dressed in the forms of justice. Imagine living in Moscow during these years. Every evening, the black cars arrive in different neighborhoods. The NKVD comes at night, typically between midnight and dawn. They knock or break down the door. They search the apartment, confiscating documents, books, photographs. They take the person away. Neighbors, watching from behind curtains, know better than to intervene or inquire. By morning, the arrested person's name is already unmentionable. Anyone could be denounced. Perhaps a colleague coveted your job. Perhaps a neighbor wanted your apartment. Perhaps you had once, years ago, expressed mild disagreement with a policy. Perhaps someone interrogated under torture mentioned your name, and now you too are implicated. The accusations didn't require evidence. Confession was the evidence, and confession could always be extracted. Some prisoners confessed to crimes they hadn't committed simply to end the torture. Others confessed hoping to save family members. Still others confessed because prolonged isolation and interrogation broke their grip on reality. The atmosphere bred a poisonous paranoia. People destroyed their personal letters, their diaries, any document that might be misinterpreted. They cut old friends from their lives, avoided social gatherings, stopped expressing opinions. At party meetings, applause for Stalin's speeches lasted longer and longer. No one wanted to be the first to stop clapping. The state encouraged denunciation as civic duty. Children were praised for informing on parents. Wives testified against husbands. The social fabric dissolved into atomized fear. By late 1938, the purge was consuming itself. So many experienced officials had been arrested that government functions were failing. Industrial production suffered from constant disruption. The Red Army was a shadow of its former capability. Even Stalin recognized the process had become counterproductive. In November 1938, he removed Yezhov from the NKVD and replaced him with Lavrentiy Beria. Yezhov was arrested in April 1939 and executed in 1940, blamed for excesses he had committed under Stalin's direct orders. The terror did not end completely. Arrests and executions continued throughout Stalin's reign, but the pace slowed dramatically. The Great Terror period, specifically 1937 to 1938, had claimed approximately 750,000 lives through execution, with perhaps 1.5 to 2 million more sent to the Gulag. The total number of victims, including those who died in camps or exile, remains debated by historians. But the effect on Soviet society was unmistakable. An entire generation of revolutionaries, intellectuals, military leaders, engineers, and ordinary citizens had been destroyed, leaving only the fearful and the compliant. The show trials themselves became a template for political persecution across the communist world. In the late 1940s and early 1950s, Eastern European communist parties staged their own show trials, complete with forced confessions and ritual self-denunciations. The Chinese Cultural Revolution echoed the same patterns of denunciation and public humiliation. The machinery Stalin perfected proved portable, exportable to any system prioritizing ideological purity over truth. But in 1938, as the terror wound down, Soviet citizens simply tried to survive. They learned not to remember, not to question, not to wonder about the empty apartments and missing colleagues. They read newspapers that denounced enemies of the people and thought carefully about nothing at all. Those who had been arrested, if they survived, wrote letters from the camps, cheerful, optimistic letters carefully designed to pass censorship, telling families not to worry, that they were being reformed through labor, that they still believed in the Soviet future. Some of these letters even contained genuine faith. Others were simply exercises in self-preservation, performed for invisible observers. Let yourself drift now, away from the interrogation cells and the courtrooms, away from the accusations and confessions. That world of terror and arbitrary justice is distant, separated by decades and unimaginable social change. You are here, safe, in a place where speech cannot doom you, where association is not conspiracy. The rhythms of your breath mark time in a quiet room, far from the chilling archives of Moscow's basements. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, archives long sealed began to open. Historians who had spent decades estimating the scale of Stalinist repression from fragments, survivor testimonies, leaked documents, demographic analysis, suddenly faced filing cabinets filled with actual records. What they found was simultaneously illuminating and frustrating, evidence that answered some questions while revealing how much complexity had been hidden, how many people had disappeared into a system designed to obscure its own scope. The questions seemed simple. how many people died in the Gulag. But simplicity dissolves on examination. Do you count only those who died within camp boundaries, or also those who perished shortly after release from camp-induced illness? Do you include executions? What about the millions deported to special settlements in remote regions? Are they part of the Gulag system or separate? What of the famines, some deliberately engineered, that swept through both camps and the broader population? Each methodological choice produces different numbers, and behind each number stand uncountable individual tragedies. Before the archives opened, the most influential Western account came from Robert Conquest, a British historian whose 1968 book, The Great Terror, shaped understanding of Stalin's purges for a generation. Conquest worked with limited sources defector testimonies, Soviet émigré accounts, demographic data showing population shortfalls, newspaper reports, and carefully analyzed Soviet publications that occasionally revealed statistics indirectly. From these fragments, he constructed estimates. He concluded that approximately 20 million people had died in the Soviet camp system and repressions between 1930 and 1953. Conquest's figures were widely accepted in the West during the Cold War, fitting into a narrative of Soviet totalitarianism as systematically murderous. But even at the time, some scholars questioned his methodology. The evidence was, as one reviewer noted, frustratingly inconclusive. Conquest extrapolated from incomplete data, making assumptions about mortality rates and camp populations that, while reasonable given available information, remained speculative. Yet his work provided the most comprehensive accounting available, and the scale he described, tens of millions dead, seemed consistent with the fragmentary testimonies emerging from survivors. During the 1980s, a group of scholars later called revisionists began offering lower estimates. Historians like J. Arch Getty, examining the same fragmentary evidence but with different assumptions, suggested the death toll might be substantially smaller. Getty argued that Soviet society under Stalin was chaotic rather than systematically controlled, that the terror resulted partly from institutional dysfunction and local initiatives rather than purely from Stalin's directives, and that the very opacity of the Soviet system had led Western scholars to overestimate its lethal efficiency. These arguments were contentious. Critics accused revisionists of minimizing Soviet crimes, of serving as apologists for mass murder. Getty found himself labeled a Stalinist, despite having no political allegiance to the Soviet system. He simply believed the evidence pointed to lower numbers. The debate became heated, personal, and sometimes unproductive. It was difficult to argue about numbers with such profound moral weight when those numbers remained fundamentally unknown. When Soviet archives became accessible after 1991, both sides returned to the evidence with new data. What emerged was complex. A 1993 study by Getty, Gabor Witherspoon, and Viktor Zemskov analyzed internal Gulag administration statistics. These showed that 1,053,829 people died in Gulag camps between 1934 and 1,953. This was dramatically lower than Conquest's estimates. Getty argued that the opening of the archives had vindicated the revisionist position. But that single figure 1,053,829 requires immediate contextualization. It counts only deaths recorded within camps, in a system not known for careful record keeping, during a period that excludes the chaotic early 1930s when collectivization and famine were at their height. It doesn't include executions outside the camps, the 700,000 shot during the Great Terror, for instance. It doesn't include the millions who passed through labor colonies, a separate part of the system with its own mortality. It doesn't count deaths in special settlements or among the deported kulaks. And critically, it was common practice to release prisoners who were dying, to remove them from the camp rolls before death so they wouldn't count against camp mortality statistics. The Gulag proper, the main camp administration, was only part of a larger system of forced labor and internal exile. Between 1930 and 1953, approximately 18 million people passed through the main Gulag camps. But another 4 to 6 million were held in labor colonies, facilities with somewhat less brutal conditions, but still involving forced labor. Another 3.5 million were sent to labor settlements. And crucially, 6 to 7 million people were deported to remote regions, Siberia, Kazakhstan, the far north, and forced into special settlements where they lived under severe restrictions, performing forced labor, but not technically imprisoned. These special settlements were particularly deadly. When Kulaks, supposedly wealthy peasants, though in practice, often anyone who resisted collectivization, were deported in massive waves between 1930 and 1934, approximately 2.4 million people were forcibly relocated. Official Soviet records, released in 1990, show that 1,803,392 people were sent to labor colonies and camps in 1930 and 1931 alone, but only 1,317,022 reached their destinations. The difference, nearly 500,000 people disappeared in transit, dead from exposure, starvation, or disease during the journey. Of those kulaks who reached the special settlements, Soviet archives record 389,521 deaths between 1932 and 1940. But these are only the recorded deaths in a system operating in remote regions with minimal infrastructure. Some historians estimate that 15 million kulaks and their families were eventually deported, with unknown numbers dying. The Chechen and Ingush deportations of 1944 recorded a 24.7% mortality rate. Nearly 1 in 4 died. The Crimean Tatar deportations showed a 19.3% mortality rate. These were not camps, but the effect was often equivalent: death through deliberate deprivation. How do you attribute a death? If a prisoner is released from a camp suffering from tuberculosis contracted there and dies 3 months later in freedom, does that count as a Gulag death? If a Kulak family is deported to Kazakhstan, given no food or shelter, and dies of starvation the first winter, are they Gulag victims or victims of the broader Soviet system? If a village is stripped of food to meet grain requisition quotas during collectivization and half the population dies, is that the Gulag or something else? The scholarly consensus now holds that between 1.5 and 1.76 million people died as a direct result of Gulag detention between 1930 and 1953, is separate from execution victims, the 750,000 shot during the Great Terror, for instance. It's separate from the famine deaths, the deportation deaths, the executions in prisons rather than camps. When these broader categories are included, estimates for total deaths from Stalinist repression range from 6 million to over 9 million, with some estimates going higher when including indirect mortality and famine victims. One method historians use to estimate casualties is demographic analysis comparing expected population growth with actual census data. The Soviet Union conducted a census in 1937, but suppressed the results because they showed a population shortfall. The officials who conducted that census were arrested and shot. A new census in 1939 produced more acceptable numbers, though later analysis suggests it was manipulated. When demographers account for birth rate declines, migration, and wartime casualties, they still find gaps in the population that suggest mortality substantially higher than recorded deaths. Some of this excess mortality came from famine. The Soviet famine of 1932-1933, caused by collectivization and grain requisitions, killed an estimated 5 to 7 million people, most in Ukraine, but also in Kazakhstan and southern Russia. This was not the Gulag, but it was state policy-forced collectivization created the conditions. And Stalin's government refused to acknowledge the famine or provide relief. Are those deaths part of the Stalinist death toll? Most historians say yes, but they belong to a different category than camp deaths. The argument between conquest and Getty, which at times became quite personal, ultimately reflected different questions. Conquest was asking, how many people died because of Stalin's policies? His 20 million figure attempted to capture total excess mortality under Stalin camps, executions, famines, deportations, and indirect deaths. Getty was asking, how many people died specifically within the Gulag camp system as recorded in Soviet administrative documents? His 1.05 million figure answered that narrower question. Both numbers can be simultaneously correct depending on what you're measuring. The archival data vindicated Getty's argument that camp mortality itself was lower than Conquest estimated. But the broader death toll from Soviet repression, when including all categories of state violence, remains in the range of multiple millions. The debate helped clarify that the Soviet system killed through various mechanisms: direct execution, deliberate starvation, lethal labor conditions, and deportation to environments incompatible with survival. Some early historians argued that the Gulag existed primarily for economic reasons, that Stalin needed massive labor forces to develop Siberia, build infrastructure, and extract resources from remote regions. The camps built canals, railroads, entire cities in the Arctic. They mined gold in Kolyma, cut timber in the northern forests, and worked in construction projects across the Soviet Union. Surely, the reasoning went, the system was designed to exploit labor. But archival research largely refuted the economic hypothesis. The camps were economically inefficient. Prisoners were poorly fed, inadequately equipped, and often unskilled for the work assigned. Mortality reduced the labor force constantly. The cost of guarding, transporting, and minimally sustaining millions of prisoners often exceeded the economic value they produced. Projects built with Gulag labor frequently failed or required massive overruns. The Gulag existed primarily for political control, to terrorize the population, to eliminate perceived enemies, to create a visible consequence for dissent. That it was also used for economic projects reflected Stalin's desire to profit from the repression, not the original purpose of the system. Even with archives open, much remains unknown. Record keeping in remote camps was often haphazard. Documents were destroyed deliberately or lost to bureaucratic chaos. Some camps existed semi-officially, their records never reaching central archives. Prisoners died in transport, in temporary holding facilities, in interrogation chambers, before ever reaching camps. Mass execution sites in forests are still being discovered, unmarked graves containing thousands of bodies. The debate over numbers continues, though with less heat than during the Cold War. Most historians now work within a range. 1.5 to 1.76 million died directly from camp conditions. Perhaps 1.7 million more were executed. Several million died in deportations and special settlements. And famines caused by state policy killed millions more. The total death toll attributable to Stalin's rule remains uncertain, somewhere between 6 million and 20 million, depending on methodology and categories included. Every number is inadequate, a crude reduction of individual suffering to statistics. Perhaps the numbers ultimately matter less than understanding what they represent. A system that treated human lives as expendable resources, that bureaucratized murder, that built a state on mass graves. Whether 1 million or 10 million died, the Gulag stands as evidence of what becomes possible when a government recognizes no limits on its power, when ideology justifies any cruelty, when citizens are reduced to categories: enemy or ally, useful or disposable, living or not yet dead. The records that survive are cold bureaucracy, lists of names, transport manifests, mortality reports filed in triplicate. Behind each entry stood a person. They had families, dreams, fears. They felt cold. They felt hunger. They died, most often, having done nothing more criminal than existing in the wrong place at the wrong time, or speaking a sentence that someone chose to interpret as dissent. The debate over how many is important for historical accuracy, but it should never obscure that each number represents someone who suffered, who died, who deserved better than to become a statistic in an academic debate. As you rest now, in warmth and safety, let these numbers and debates fade into abstraction, where they belong historical questions for historians to parse. The past holds its tragedies at a distance. Your breath slows. The room around you is quiet. No one is counting you. No one is coming in the night. These are simply facts from another time, another place, preserved now only in documents and fading memory. While millions labored in frozen camps and ordinary Soviet citizens queued for hours to purchase bread, another world existed parallel, invisible, and profoundly hypocritical. The nomenklatura, the Soviet Union's privileged class, enjoyed lives of comfort that would have seemed decadent in any capitalist society. They were not officially a separate class. Communist ideology denied such distinctions could exist in a worker state. But the reality was unmistakable. Power brought privilege, and privilege accumulated in the hands of those who controlled the Communist Party apparatus. The term nomenklatura originally referred to lists of positions, key posts in government, industry, military, and cultural institutions whose occupants required approval from party committees. If you held a position on the Central Committee's nomenklatura list, your appointment had been vetted and approved at the highest levels. By the late Stalin era, approximately 1,500 to 2,000 positions fell under direct Central Committee control. Regional and local party committees maintained their own lists for positions within their jurisdictions. Together, these lists encompassed perhaps 750,000 officials across the Soviet Union, the people who actually ran the country behind the facade of worker democracy. But nomenklatura meant more than just a staffing system. It became synonymous with the officials themselves, the nomenklaturshik, who enjoyed privileges far beyond ordinary citizens. These privileges were carefully calibrated according to rank, creating a hierarchy as rigid as any aristocracy. The higher your position on the nomenklatura list, the more access you gain to a world of special stores, foreign goods, comfortable housing, quality healthcare, and opportunities denied to the masses you supposedly represented. Imagine walking down a Moscow street in 1970. You pass a queue of perhaps 200 people waiting outside a state grocery store, hoping to purchase whatever might be available today, perhaps sausage, perhaps butter, perhaps nothing worth the wait. Shelves in ordinary Soviet stores were chronically understocked. Consumer goods were scarce. Quality was poor. But if you possess the right credentials, you don't shop at these stores. The Beryozka stores, their name means little birch, existed in major cities as exclusive shops where only foreign currency was accepted. Initially established in 1964 for tourists and to extract hard currency from visitors, they quickly became accessible to certain Soviet citizens, diplomats who earned foreign currency, athletes and artists who traveled abroad, and crucially, high-ranking officials who received special vouchers or currency allowances. Inside a Beryozka, you could find luxury goods impossible to obtain elsewhere. French cognac, Swiss chocolate, Italian shoes, Japanese electronics, even Soviet-made cars without the typical multi-year waiting list. The stores also sold books banned from regular Soviet bookstores' works by Boris Pasternak and Osip Mandelstam. For instance, authors whose writing was considered ideologically suspect, but whose international prestige made their books valuable tourist merchandise. The irony was sharp. Ordinary Soviet citizens could be arrested for possessing these books, but party elites could purchase them with foreign currency. The dictatorship of the proletariat had created a two-tier system where power determined access to goods, information, and culture. Beyond Beryozka, the nomenklatura had access to closed stores not open to any tourist special shops, supplied with food and goods reserved exclusively for party officials. These shops weren't advertised. They had no signs. You needed to know where they were, and you needed credentials to enter. Inside, shelves stocked imported foods, quality meats, fresh produce, and consumer goods that ordinary Soviets saw only in propaganda films about Western decadence. Party officials didn't queue. They didn't worry about shortages. The system that preached equality ensured they never experienced the deprivation imposed on everyone else. Housing in Soviet cities was cramped and communal. Families often shared apartments with other families, dividing space with curtains, negotiating access to shared kitchens and bathrooms. Privacy was a luxury few possessed. But the nomenklatura lived differently. They occupied spacious apartments in the centers of Moscow and other cities, apartments seized from the pre-revolutionary bourgeoisie or built specifically for party use. Multiple rooms, private bathrooms, space to breathe. Even more privileged was access to dachas, country houses in exclusive settlements outside Moscow and other major cities. These weren't simple cottages. They were substantial residences set on large plots, surrounded by forests and gardens, staffed by servants, protected by guards. Officials could retreat here on weekends and holidays, escaping the urban density their policies had created. The dachas came with state-provided cars and drivers to transport officials between their city apartments, their offices, and their country retreats. While ordinary citizens navigated crowded public transport, the nomenklatura moved through Moscow in chauffeur-driven Volgas and ZILs. Stalin's own dacha at Kontsivo, where he spent his final years, became the de facto center of Soviet power. The residence featured a long dining room with a polished table, rose-colored carpets, and portraits of Lenin and Maxim Gorky adorning the walls. It was here that Stalin hosted his infamous late-night gatherings, where policy and paranoia mixed with excessive drinking. These were not optional social events. They were command performances where the dictator's closest collaborators gathered for dinners that stretched until dawn. The gatherings at Stalin's dacha deserve their own consideration, for they reveal the strange mixture of privilege and terror that defined life at the top of the Soviet hierarchy. After World War II, as Stalin's health declined, he withdrew from the Kremlin and ruled increasingly from his dacha. Several evenings each week, he would summon his closest collaborators, Molotov, Beria, Khrushchev, Malenkov, for he called informal dinners. These dinners were lavish beyond imagination for a country where rationing had only recently ended. Stalin, reconnecting with his Georgian roots, ensured the table groaned with sumptuous dishes from across the Soviet Union's 11 time zones. At least 10 varieties of vodka were always available, along with Georgian wines and fine cognacs. The food was abundant, extravagant, wasteful, a sharp contrast to the austere existence of ordinary Soviet citizens struggling to survive on inadequate rations. But Stalin's guests dreaded these invitations. As Nikita Khrushchev later wrote in his memoirs, there was only one person who had fun during his parties: Stalin. The dinners were exercises in humiliation and control. Stalin would force his subordinates to drink excessively, mocking them as they became intoxicated, testing their loyalty through elaborate games and cruel pranks. He made important policy decisions during these gatherings, wielding power through dinner conversation, while his colleagues, drunk and exhausted, struggled to keep pace with his shifting moods. The gatherings often lasted until 3 or 4 in the morning. Officials had to remain alert, had to laugh at Stalin's jokes, had to avoid saying anything that might be interpreted as disloyalty. Any misstep could result in arrest, as several of Stalin's dinner companions eventually discovered. The privilege of being invited to these banquets came with the constant fear that each invitation might be your last. The elite experienced luxury, yes, but luxury poisoned by paranoia, though this was still vastly preferable to the fate of the millions laboring in camps or struggling in communal apartments. The nomenklatura enjoyed access to exclusive medical facilities with Western-trained doctors and imported medications. When ordinary Soviets visited understaffed clinics with shortages of basic supplies, party officials received treatment in specialized hospitals reserved for their use. The Kremlin clinic became legendary for its quality of care, available only to the highest ranks. This extended to families' children of the elite received better health care than their contemporaries in the general population. Education followed similar patterns. While the Soviet system claimed to provide universal education, quality varied dramatically. The children of nomenklatura members attended special schools where classes were smaller, teachers better qualified, and opportunities far greater. These schools served as training grounds for the next generation of Soviet leadership. Despite communist rhetoric about eliminating inherited privilege, the children of the elite had clear advantages over children of workers or peasants. They were more likely to gain university admission, more likely to receive prestigious job assignments, more likely to join the nomenklatura themselves. Privilege, officially abolished, was quietly hereditary. For ordinary Soviet citizens, foreign travel was effectively impossible. Passports were internal documents, not international ones. The state controlled exit visas with extreme stringency. Most Soviets would never see another country, never experience life outside the system. But the nomenklatura traveled not as tourists, for tourism was suspect, but on official delegations, cultural exchanges, and diplomatic assignments. These foreign trips offered glimpses of Western prosperity that created cognitive dissonance for many officials. They saw grocery stores overflowing with goods, housing standards far exceeding Soviet norms, consumer electronics, and automobiles of quality unmatched by Soviet production. Some officials became cynical, understanding that communist ideology masked a reality of Soviet backwardness. Others rationalized what they saw, blaming capitalist exploitation while quietly enjoying the Western goods they could purchase and bring home. Diplomats stationed abroad lived particularly privileged lives. They could shop in Western stores, experience cultural events, and send their children to international schools. When they returned to the Soviet Union, they brought with them foreign currency, valuable goods, and status elevated by their international experience. The gap between their worldview and that of ordinary Soviets, who had never left their regions, widened into an unbridgeable chasm. Life within the nomenklatura was comfortable, but never truly secure. Position and privilege depended entirely on party approval, which could be withdrawn at any moment. Officials understood that their apartments, their dashas, their special store access, their chauffeurs, all of it belonged to the state and could vanish with a single bureaucratic decision or a whispered denunciation. This created a culture of intense loyalty displays and mutual surveillance. Central committee meetings in the Kremlin were ritualized performances where officials demonstrated ideological correctness, applauded enthusiastically for Stalin's speeches, and competed to express the most fervent devotion to the party line. Privately, many officials harbored doubts, disagreements, and resentments, but these could never be expressed openly. The same system that imprisoned millions for thought crimes applied to the elite as well, though they faced it from positions of relative comfort. When purges came, as they periodically did, even high-ranking officials disappeared. The privilege of the nomenklatura came with the understanding that it could all end at any moment. The contrast was stark and deliberate. A country that had revolutionized in the name of equality, that claimed to have eliminated class distinctions that executed, and imprisoned the former aristocracy for their exploitation of workers, had created a new ruling class with privileges exceeding those of the Tsarist elite. The nomenklatura lived in luxury, while those they governed struggled. They shopped in special stores, while ordinary citizens queued for hours for basic goods. They traveled abroad while denying exit visas to others. They ate banquets at Stalin's dasha, while millions survived on inadequate rations. Michael Voslensky, a Soviet dissident scholar who later fled to the West, wrote extensively about this hypocrisy. The dictatorship of the proletariat was a fiction. He argued the reality was dictatorship by a new privileged class that used communist ideology to justify its power. The nomenklatura had become what the Bolsheviks had claimed to eliminate, a ruling elite whose position derived from control over the state apparatus rather than ownership of capital. but whose lives were nonetheless characterized by privilege, comfort, and a vast separation from the masses they claimed to represent. The system's defenders argued that party officials worked hard, bore great responsibilities, and deserved some recognition. But the scale of privilege went far beyond reasonable reward for service. It constituted a fundamental betrayal of revolutionary ideals. Workers in factories lived in communal apartments and struggled to feed their families. Political prisoners froze in Siberian camps. Peasants labored on collective farms for minimal compensation. And party officials shopped in Berioska stores, relaxed in their dashas, and sent their children to elite schools. The gap between ideology and reality was so vast that maintaining the pretense required constant propaganda, constant censorship, and constant repression of anyone who pointed out the hypocrisy. As you drift now toward sleep, let these contradictions fade. The Soviet Union, with all its complex cruelties and hypocrisies, dissolved decades ago. The nomenclatura are memories now, their special stores that closed, their privileged systems dismantled. History preserves these stories as lessons, as warnings, as reminders of what can emerge when idealism curdles into tyranny and equality rhetoric masks elite exploitation. But none of it can touch you here. You are warm. You are comfortable. You are free to close your eyes and let these distant troubles recede into the past where they belong. We have walked through harsh landscapes tonight, the frozen camps of Siberia where millions labored and died, the show trial chambers where revolution consumed its own children, the scholarly debates over death tolls that will never fully capture the human cost, and the privileged world of party elites who built their comfort on others' suffering. These are heavy histories, difficult truths about human capacity for cruelty and systemic oppression. But you are here, now, far removed from those times and places. The Gulag system was dismantled. The Soviet Union fell. Archives opened, and scholars continue carefully documenting what happened, so that memory persists even as survivors pass away. The system that once seemed permanent, that controlled an enormous empire and threatened to last forever, proved as mortal as everything human. It ended, as all tyrannies eventually end, leaving behind only documents, memories, and lessons for those willing to learn them. As you settle deeper into rest, reflect for just a moment on the comfort you possess, the freedom to speak without fear, to read without censorship, to sleep without wondering if tonight is the night the secret police arrive. These are not small things. They are the difference between the world we've explored tonight and the world you inhabit. Let that gratitude ease you toward sleep. The stories of Siberian prisoners, of show trial victims, of deported families and privileged elites all recede now into history's vast archive. They matter. They deserve remembering, but they need not trouble your rest. Close your eyes. Let your breathing slow. The past is fixed and distant. The present is warm and safe. And tomorrow awaits with its own concerns, far removed from the frozen camps and paranoid purges of Stalin's Soviet Union. Sleep well.